Dealing with an aggressive kid can be very stressful and challenging. Well, this child psychologist has a few ideas that might help you out. Let's dig in. Hi, this is Dr. Brett Pearce, child psychologist, and today we're going to be talking about aggressive kids. And before we jump too far into this, I just invite people to really think about what aggression means, because very often people will think about displays of anger that are more kind of emotive or expressive without actual direct aggressive behaviors, such as things like hitting, throwing things, biting, pushing, threatening, things like that truly are aggressive. They'll want to say that those kids are aggressive. Now, you might have a kid with a temper problem, which is sort of different, but for the purposes of this video, we really want to be thinking about kids who really struggle with actual aggressive behavior: hitting, kicking, throwing things, destroying things, threatening, etc. So there are basically three big ways that we want to work on dealing with aggressive kids. Now, to preface this, I will say that aggressive behavior in kids can be a very tricky issue to deal with. And if you are dealing with a kid who's got a lot of it, you really should seek out the support of a competent child therapist to try to help you and your kid navigate these issues better. But here's some of the ways that I do it. So first of all, what we need to think about is a healthy way of dealing with anger, and especially helping your kid learn better ways of dealing with concerns that your kid may have. Really, one of the origins of anger is that we have things that are not working well for us and things that are making us feel not so great. Anger is a secondary emotion, and it is always connected with something like fear or shame or trauma or possibly guilt, though not usually as guilt, or guilt is not usually as much of an anger-provoking, painful feeling. The bottom line is, though, that if you didn't have a hurt feeling underneath anger, you would have no reason to be angry. And so kids who deal with a lot of aggression almost always have a lot of anger. And this is to say that they usually have things that are of concern to them, and these could be big or small, these could be at home or at school, whatever, that are not being addressed, maybe because the kid doesn't have the power or the skill or the wherewithal to know how to address their concerns. And so the aggressive behavior is often a kind of way of dealing with that. So let's take a couple of examples of this. I've worked with some kids whose anger and aggressive behavior specifically take probably the most common form of aggressive behavior problem, which is hitting. That hitting can be about all kinds of different things. So I've seen kids whose hitting is basically a way of kind of like really forcing their parents to pay attention to them, which may sound highly petty, but getting love and attention is important. I've seen kids whose hitting is a way of trying to contain the behavior problems of siblings because of the anxiety it provokes to have all that kind of chaos going around, and to be worried that someone's going to get in trouble, and there's just all this anxiety and tension surrounding that, a lot of fear of what would happen. And so the kid kind of takes matters into his own hands. I could go on and on about various examples, but the bottom line is what we want to do is to really sit down and think, what concerns does this kid seem to have? What's going on? Is this kid hungry and doesn't realize it? Is this kid tired and does not realize it? Are there some sibling conflicts going on that we need to figure out how to resolve? Is kiddo struggling in school? Is kiddo not feeling safe and happy at school? Usually you want to connect the aggressive behavior with where it occurs in terms of the likely location of where the concerns are happening. But the bottom line is, what we want to do is to facilitate a situation where we can help the kid learn how to recognize and voice concerns and have those concerns taken seriously by the adults, because that's one big problem, is that we adults often really struggle to recognize and to appropriately respond to anything but the biggest and most obvious of child concerns. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't mean to come down too hard on us adults, but understandably, sometimes that is very difficult for us to recognize the real power of certain concerns for certain kids. One example of this might be maybe it's really hard for us to understand why some kids get so upset in the store when they want something and are told no. Now, I certainly support parents and adults in saying no to purchasing things for kids. I mean, that's obviously sometimes necessary. However, for us, it could be like, look, it's a candy bar. Why is it this big of a deal? But for the kid, it's just like, look, this is a special, special thing to me to be able to go out just with you, and then it's so awesome to be at the store, and I work so hard to try to be on my best behavior, and then getting something good from you that you buy for me, just for me, is so special to me that when it doesn't happen, it is really devastating to me. And it still is okay for us to say no. It's just also good for us to really recognize what is behind all of that. It's not just the kid trying to manipulate you. It's not just the kid trying to put one over on you or make your day harder. Really, there's usually a whole inner life to these kinds of behavioral difficulties. So it's important for us to sit down and say, okay, let's think about what's going on for you, and let's think of better ways of dealing with that. And sometimes just sitting a kid down and taking concerns seriously and thinking of reasonable ways of addressing those concerns rather than aggression is really powerful. Second thing we want to think about is we want to think about what seems to be the motivation behind the aggressive behavior, because depending on the kid, that might require significantly different responses. So remember earlier how I pitched the example of the kid who was hitting in order to get parents' attention versus kid who was hitting in order to kind of contain siblings so that there wouldn't be any big chaos and behavior problems because it was really anxiety provoking. Those are two significantly different motivations for aggression. One is about kind of like wanting attention and interaction, which is fine and normal and healthy. Another one is more about wanting to avoid anxiety. Another one could be about hitting in order to escape a demand. So an example of that might be a kiddo who hits when parents say it's time to do chores or time to do homework, because the hitting is basically saying, well, I don't want to have to engage in that demand. And so all of these are really different. Particularly what we want to think about is the difference between escaping demands and attention and interaction. Now, it'd be very difficult for me to really unpack this in a lot of detail in the kind of 10 to 15 minute video that I typically make on the channel. But for the kid who's seeking attention, what we really need to do is to think about making sure that when the kid's behavior looks even halfway decent or even neutral, that we're giving good attention and interaction to that kid, particularly if we're talking about a pretty little kid. And we want to be careful about responding with a lot of big confrontational behavior when the kid hits, because what we could do if we do that is we basically kind of teach the kid that this is the kind of attention you're going to get from me, and what you're going to get, or when you're going to get it, is when you hit. And so very often what we have to do is kind of watch out for the things that tell us that the kid is particularly interested in our attention and is particularly stressed out if they're not going to get it. And we need to think about really timing our attention appropriately. On the flip side, with a kid who's escaping a demand, we would want to be careful about that, because the kinds of things that we might do, like, okay, well, you hit me or something like that, or it's time for you to do your homework, but I'm not going to give you a lot of attention because, I don't want that to reinforce your hitting. Well, that's a problem, right? Because if the kid's motivation is to escape the demand, then it's like, okay, cool. Well, you're now leaving me alone, and that's what I want you to do. So we often have to be sort of the opposite in a sense, where we really vigorously kind of confront the hitting and confront the the kind of defiance or whatever you want to call it that's going on with the homework. So the second thing we need to think about with childhood aggressive behavior is what's motivating the aggression for the kid, and in what context the kid is, because some kids might have different motivations in different contexts. The third thing that we want to do about aggression is more about what not to do. And you guessed it, and I know that you get tired of hearing it, but it is really, really important. We want to be careful that we are not punishing the aggression, and certainly not relying on that strategy as sort of like a de facto or as kind of a catch-all. I'm certainly okay with the idea that in some situations where there's been aggression, that we do think about something like a timeout, maybe something restitutional, like writing a little letter to your brother to say, I'm so sorry I hit you, I'm so sorry I broke your toy. And even then, with restitutional ways of kind of dealing with like a restitutional consequence, it's still unlikely to be that effective by itself, particularly if you've got a real persistent difficulty with aggression going on. What we certainly don't want to do is to really use a lot of power and coercion. And yes, a lot of the things that people might commonly do, like taking toys away, like grounding, like restricting privileges unless there's a real direct logical reason to do so because of safety issues associated with the aggressive behavior, all of those things do count as coercive parenting strategies. Coercion basically means when we use power and force, which is to say the threat of pain or the giving of a reward, particularly if we're really kind of over relying on that, it really doesn't produce good results. In fact, research on the subject very consistently indicates that those kinds of punishment strategies tend to only produce anger. And the last time I checked, increasing someone's anger is not a great way to get them to be less aggressive. But not only does it only increase anger, but actually those kinds of punishment strategies tend to be resulted in outcome studies done on the subject, and there's been a lot. It tends to only be associated with worse outcomes in terms of the kid's behavioral success. So very often, one of the biggest things that we need to do with an aggressive kid, particularly if we're using a lot of punishment, which is understandably tempting, is we need to omit that punishment. Yes, omit it. And some people come back to me and say, well, what do I do instead? Well, okay, I mean, I've given us some ideas on what to do instead, and it's complicated and it depends on the kid. But when we're doing something that actively makes something worse, we need to stop doing that thing. And unless there's some kind of other benefit it's providing, like if the kid's behavioral issues, if punishment made kids really cease really problematic aggressive behavior, which it doesn't, but if it did, but was maybe producing a little bit of like minor misbehaviors, like maybe the kid started swearing a little bit more or something like that, which I personally don't consider a misbehavior, but most people would, then okay, I guess it would be worth it. I guess we could kind of consider it to be a useful intervention that has some side effects. But it's not a useful intervention that has side effects. It's just something, in my view, that is actively worsening the situation. And there's a lot of research to back that up, by the way. So, bottom line is, aggression in kids can be complicated, but the first thing that we need to do is to sit down and figure out how to help the kid recognize what things are bothering the kid, what needs are not being met, what feelings are not being addressed. How do we express those concerns? How do we adults accept and validate those concerns and support and assist and coach the kid with expressing and addressing those concerns in a more constructive manner? The second thing that we've talked about is how aggression can be often motivated by very different motivations, and that we need to respond quite differently to different kids. And perhaps it would be good for me to make a follow-up series of videos on different ways that kids can be motivated and how it's important for us to respond to them differently. And then the third thing we talked about is how important it is to omit or at least dramatically avoid the use of punishment with kids, accepting kind of like maybe some simple things that are restitutional and not exactly coercive in nature. Because in general, punishments are associated with worse outcomes for kids, and they are also associated with making anyone, kids or adults, angry when we're punished. And anger does not help aggression. So I hope this video has been of use. Please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already by clicking a button down below. You can also consider giving me a thumbs up. We recently surpassed 400 subscribers. I had a huge subscriber burst in the last couple weeks. The channel nearly doubled in size in that regard, so that's pretty cool. So at any rate, thank you so much. This is Dr. Brett Pearce about to sign out. Take care.